Hai everyone, kembali bersama saya Timo di Mager.club. Kali ini kita akan melanjutkan Discovery Tour Assassin's Creed. Harusnya ini yang terakhir kali ya, karena trofinya tinggal 1. Ayo langsung aja. Temple and Priests.
Welcome to Temples and Priests. From its foundation, the city of Memphis favored worship of the god Ptah. The main temple of Ptah was known as Hutkapta, meaning temples were the center of religious, political, and economic life in ancient Egypt. These sacred places were viewed as the literal home of the gods and goddesses. Located in the center of Memphis, the Temple of Ptah was the most prominent and imposing building in the city. The long walkway leading toward the temple, known as the Dromos, was guarded by rows of sphinxes. The entire sacred area was designed to keep this. The Dromos opened into a courtyard, with a surrounding portico graced with columns carved to resemble palm trees. During special festivals, the general population was allowed to enter this location, but under no circumstance. The Memphis Alabaster Sphinx was discovered in 1912, almost completely buried in water and sand. Erosion has destroyed it, making it difficult to determine when it was created. Egyptologists believe that its facial likeness resembles. The size of the imposing sculpture reflects the importance it had to the temple during the New Kingdom. This Sphinx is one of the few remaining artifacts from the ruins of Memphis to survive. In Egyptian culture, some animals were associated with gods, while others were considered to be living gods. The Apis bull was believed to be a divine entity. The earliest mention of the Apis bull in ancient Egypt goes back as far. Originally the symbol of fertility, the Apis bull was linked to the god Ra, with the image of the sun carried between its horns. Later it was associated. The Apis bull lived with its harem in a sacred barn located in an enclosure in the Temple of Ptah. Each bull bore 29 signs representative of its divinity. Among them, the bull had an eagle-shaped mark on its back, a double tail hair, and a scarab-shaped mark under the tongue. Like other living divinities, the mortal incarnation of the Apis bull was prayed to, and when it died, it was given a luxurious funeral, which included mummification. Until the reign of Ramses II, the Apis bulls were buried in individual graves in Saqqara. Believed that temple rituals were essential to maintain order in the cosmos and allow communication. Details of the ceremonies found on temple walls provide a thorough overview of the stages of the daily ritual performed. The high priest would first awaken the sleeping god with a chant. Then the seals of the shrine's doors were broken and the bolts drawn back. The god was then washed with incense-infused water, and its mouth rinsed with mineral salts. The cleansing was followed by adorning the statue with jewels. Heredity was the primary source of new recruits. Rarely was an outsider allowed this position. At the top of the temple, high priest candidates made their way up the ranks of the temple hierarchy. In the 21st dynasty, Thebes became the capital of an almost entirely theocratic government. The educational institution in ancient Egypt was known as the House of Life. Attended by only 2 known centers have been uncovered, one in the abandoned city of Akhenaten, and one at the The House of Life offered training for the elite, destined for occupation. Not limited to instruction for young students, the House of Life was a source of reference for many scholars, to papyri of many disciplines. Because papyri were preserved there, The Greco-Romans referred to the ancient Egyptian economy was based on an unequal system of redistribution of goods. The state of Egypt There are records of pharaohs making offerings of large tracts of land and animals to temples. Palaces, warehouses, and granaries were built inside the temple compound to better control the redistribution of goods. The size of the recorded numbers of goods, combined with every other function filled by temples, only serves to confirm their might as economic, religious, and political centers of power within Egypt.
Okay, let's move on. Masih banyak. Kayak gue udah bilang sebelumnya, lamanya di loading ya nih.
Welcome to Building Ancient Egypt. Constructed with bricks made of mud, most ancient Egyptian buildings were not permanent. Only religious temples and funerary monuments were meant to stay.
Hancur. Hujan gimana?
Limestone was common and easy to extract from quarries on the east bank of the Nile.
Okay, limestone kapur.
This particular limestone had marine fossils in it, however, preventing it from being easily. Ancient Egyptians preferred to use sedimentary rock beds, or layers like sandstone and limestone, because they were. Workers would draw a large grid directly on the stone's surface, taking care to leave a space between the blocks. This allowed them to isolate the different blocks and create a trench that would make the extraction easier.
Salah.
Stone workers used iron chisels for hard rock, and bronze or copper tools for softer rocks. The gallery extraction technique was used when the desired rock was buried under layers of rubble. This method was often. To cut the stone, they created a longitudinal curve or slit, and then cut the rock at a 90-degree angle. The lower side was to maintain the stability of these mining pits over the course of quarrying, workers would leave support sections of unexcavated rock.
Okay.
In every quarry, dedicated shrines were established to offer protection for the workers. In particular, Serket, a powerful deity among quarry workers. Every mine and quarry of ancient Egypt included a scorpion charmer, who was said to use magical powers to ward off the dangerous insects and keep the workers safe.
Okay, lanjut.
Welcome to Workers. Whether workers were employed for the pyramid construction or at the quarries, the government supplied food and housing. Workers for the pyramids and skilled architects and engineers were employed year-round, while support labor were often. Archaeological research shows that no food was stored or prepared on site, but instead workers received abundant rations of bread, beer. While some quarries were close to the Nile, others were located across the desert and required long expeditions.
Niat sih bikinnya.
These expeditions,
benar-benar kayak dunia
whenever
hidup.
possible, blocks were toppled from a higher elevation onto the sled. Workers then poured water onto the clay at the front of the sled, creating a slick surface to more easily. During flood season, the Nile was at its largest and deepest, which allowed the transportation of the heaviest and biggest loads.
Kalau banjir malah buat
close to
bangun.
the river had troughs. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri detail a limestone load intended for the Khufu pyramid that weighed in at 70 to 80 tons, or 30 blocks.
10 ton.
Stone cargo generally weighed 15 tons per boat, amounting to roughly 6 or 7 blocks per trip. For heavier loads such as obelisks, monolithic... River transportation was the most efficient way to ferry stone blocks between the quarry and the construction
Untuk
site.
kapal-kapal ngangkut ya.
Blocks were transported by flotillas of several types of boats. The most detailed illustration of transport by river is a relief of Queen Hatshepsut's barge with an accompanying flotilla.
Oke.
Welcome to Agriculture and Seasons.
Wow, this is good graphics.
While crops were cultivated in different oases around the desert, most of the arable lands were near the Nile. Two types of cereal grain were cultivated, barley and an ancient wheat known as emmer. The Ptolemaic era created an agricultural revolution with the introduction of advanced agricultural techniques and new grain types such as rice, durum wheat, and pearl millet. The resulting agricultural mass production greatly increased the economy of ancient Egypt. It also prompted the development of storage and transportation, allowing long-distance trade with other regions. Both bread and beer rations were part of a system of barter payment. The state used those goods to pay wages for those who worked in the quarries and at the construction sites. Beer was so important to ancient Egyptians, they had a goddess of beer brewing, Tenenet. Tenenet is seen in many paintings and sculptures with... In order to increase agricultural production, fertile land was divided into plots and large agricultural villages were encouraged. The state and temples were the biggest landowners. Depending on the region, fertile land was managed by individuals. Ancient Egyptians relied on rudimentary tools for land cultivation. Soil was broken down with hoes, and wing plows were used to make furrows. The three seasons known as Akhet, Heret, and Shemu corresponded to a specific phase of the agricultural process and the river's natural changes. Akhet was the time of the flood, beginning with the appearance of the star Sirius in July. Heret was the time when lands were cultivated, plowed, and sown. This fell between October and November. Shemu ran from May to September and was when harvesting and taxation began. The pharaoh's duty was to uphold order against chaos and provide for his people. Priests and local governors also wanted to appear as protectors of the people. However, any variation in the Nile's seasons could cause water shortages. This had devastating consequences on wheat and barley crops. The pharaoh, administrators, and priests knew they needed to demonstrate their ability to prevent such a catastrophe from happening. And so they invented the story. The story begins with the pharaoh worried for his people. The Nile hasn't flooded in years, and his people are starving. In search of the origins of the flooding, Djoser seeks out Khnum, the protector god of the region and the source of the drought. Djoser gives the god offerings and orders his priests to restore the Temple of Khnum. These offerings please the god, and the floods are restored. This story was intended to highlight the importance of the deity in everyone's daily lives,
Religius
while
banget
also
sih
demonstrating the
jawabannya
crucial
tuh.
role that the priests and the king played in feeding and protecting the people of Egypt.
Alright.
Welcome to ancient Egyptian culture. The new grain types of the Ptolemaic period required a great deal of water. Farmers
Cultivation.
needed to ensure they had effective, consistent irrigation. The Nile's right. Later, a sakya, or water wheel, was invented. The
Ke water
sakya
wheel.
needed animals to turn the wheel, which rotated buckets through the water.
Oh.
It drew the water to an elevation of 3.5 meters and enabled a great deal of separated the grain from its husk. Workers would spread the ears on clean ground. Oxen, cows, or donkeys were then guided. Winnowing was the stage where workers used wooden scoops to throw ears in the air. The wind carried off the chaff, leaving the heavier seeds to fall to the ground. This action was repeated until the undesired material. Transporting large amounts of grain required ships equipped to carry heavy loads. These goods were moved during the Nile's flooding season, when the river was deep. Having reached Alexandria's inner harbor, the wheat was unloaded under the supervision of a civil servant in charge of wheat management. Portions were distributed to Alexandria's city market, and the remaining stockpile was either exported. Grain storage facilities were located across all of Egypt. Temples and institutions had large silos, while individual houses had storage sheds. In some houses, when the grain was ready for processing, it was poured into bowls and pounded into a coarse flour. That flour was then passed through a sieve. The sieves used by ancient Egyptians were unable to filter out sand and stones. Grit often passed into the flour, causing long-term deteriorations among all classes of Egyptians.
Teknologinya belum nyampe ya istilahnya.
Welcome to Domesticated Animals of Ancient Egypt.
Oh, emang tentang itu.
Agriculture and domesticated livestock were introduced 6,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found traces of cattle, donkeys, pigs, and dogs. Dromedary are thought to have been introduced during the Persian invasion. Pets were deeply cherished in ancient Egypt. Many illustrations of children often include a pet in the depiction.
Oh.
One of ancient Egypt's most iconic animals, the cat, wasn't adopted into their daily life until the Middle Kingdom. Capable of killing snakes and rodents, cats were present throughout every period, However, they only became pets sometime during the Middle Kingdom. Prince Thutmose, son of Amenhotep III, had his cat Tamu. The earliest reference to dogs dates back to 5000 BCE. They were popular pets as they helped hunters and protected herds. They were closely linked to Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Baboons, monkeys, and even falcons were tamed as pets. Each was mummified and buried with as much ceremony as any family member.
Welcome to ancient Egyptian medicine. Evidence of advanced medical procedures have been found on mummies, and ancient Egyptians left detailed. Another similar document, the Ebers Medical Papyrus, is over 20 meters long and 30 centimeters wide.
Mereka percaya religion tapi butuh science juga. Bagus kayak gitu, imbang.
Remedies were considered as medicine and carried by doctors and priests. Village doctors often had another job alongside their medical duties and the preparation of medicines. A cure for blindness was made of fermented honey, ochre, and coal. The science behind it was that honey functioned as an antiseptic and antibacterial, while ochre would reduce the swelling. All of their knowledge did not always suffice. Ramses II died of an infection caused by an abscessed tooth.
Gue dari tadi pakai orang ini ya, Telomi, apa saudaranya Cleopatra ya.
Welcome to leather and linen in ancient Egypt. Tanning, a process which dates from prehistoric times, was present although not highly valued in Egypt due to the heat.
Okay, dijemur.
Leather was reserved mainly for things such as sheets, quivers, and other similar items. Leopard hides, unlike regular leather, were highly valued and usually worn by priests. Valued for its coolness and freshness in hot weather, linen was the fiber most commonly used for fabrics and textiles. It was produced from flax, which was plentiful in Egypt. Fibers were usually dyed before weaving. While color was used in the production of textiles, dyes weren't commonly used for clothing, and most Egyptians wore. Various shades were achieved using woad, a dye produced from the leaves of Isotis tinctoria. The plant was cultivated for this purpose within the Nile Delta and allowed for the creation of various colors. For example, this area's style is strongly influenced by the dye baths and tanneries of modern-day Fes in Morocco. This helped Ubisoft envision what such locations might have been like in ancient Egypt.
Behind the scenes.
While this tannery is within the city walls, back then they were often found outside the city boundaries. The tanner's trade was considered off-putting by the Greeks, as all these operations resulted in noxious smells.
Nggak jam lagi, udah setengah lebih.
Welcome
langsung
to
mulai.
Ancient Egyptian Fashions.
Oh, fashion.
Learning what life was like for ancient Egyptians presents many differences, and yet also surprising similarities to how people might live today. Jewelry was a popular item among ancient Egyptians of all social standing, both men and... The jewelry of the elite was made from gold, silver, and other precious stones.
Makin elit, makin banyak.
Though idealized, tomb paintings are a catalog of the changing fashions of ancient Egypt from the old to... The fabric of ancient Egyptian clothing was almost entirely made from various grades of linen. Linen was commonly white.
Toilet?
Cosmetics, including concoctions to prevent body odor and bad breath, were an integral part of everyday life for Egyptians.
Maksudnya itu kosmetik.
Used by both men and women. Egyptians believed kohl had magical powers, wearing it as black eyeliner to protect their eyes from the sun and to prevent eye infections from particles in the flooded Nile River. A special... Women and teenage... Wealthier women included carved combs or hairpins. Wigs were very popular, used for special occasions or to conceal gray hair or baldness. They were fastened in place with beeswax. The most expensive wigs were... Prepubescent children generally had their heads shaved. Young girls kept some strands intact, while young boys had a braid worn on the side.
Oke, lanjut. Artisans of Ancient Egypt.
Welcome to... It was under the watchful eye of Ptah of Memphis, the god of craft and architecture, that ancient Egyptians developed... Ancient Egyptian craftspeople created both art and a wide variety of mundane... Art, in all its forms, has offered not only a practical insight into the way ancient Egyptians lived, but in how they viewed the world. In ancient Egyptian culture, drawing was used as illustration, such as seen in the Book of the Dead. It was also the first step in the creation of a relief, painting, or statue. Two-dimensional representations were concerned with order and form, and were intended to honor gods and promote the transition of the soul to the afterlife.
Gue nggak diserang nih. Oke, selamat.
Stylistically, Egyptians were concerned with the depiction of the human form's inner self. As such, artistic representations were not concerned with realism, but rather with idealized... An exception to this were scenes depicting hunting and battle, where the environment and enemies moved in lively, even chaotic ways. And reliefs could be either in high relief or low relief. Either method required a surface suited to the desired technique. For reliefs,
gambarnya dari museum di New York itu ya.
Red, then framed with a red grid to position the elements of the scenes. Statues were believed to be vessels for the souls of the deceased, or deities. That is why a sculptor was called the one who makes it live. In ancient Egypt, the profession of crafter was organized and relied on a
crafting penting
At
ya.
the domestic level, most Egyptians were craftspeople to a greater or lesser extent. The ability to repair tools was a daily necessity, could also be bartered for at the local. An ancient text known as the Satires of Trades has a number of descriptive summaries that offer. Located near the Valley of the Kings, Deir el-Medina was a settlement created by order of the king. Archaeologists believe the site was home to skilled and respected artisans for over 400 years. It is considered one of the most important discoveries relating to Egyptian daily life. While much of the focus of Egyptian archaeology was on its kings and queens, it wasn't until the excavation of Deir el-Medina that Egyptologists were given a valuable window into the community life of ancient Egyptian artisans.
Tinggal 5 lagi.
Welcome to Evolution. Excavations all over Egypt have uncovered enormous quantities of pottery vessels of all shapes.
Pottery aja dibahas loh, ini detail banget sih.
Pottery was essential to ancient Egyptians' daily lives. It was used in all aspects of life. Early pots were made from pinched or coiled clay. The potter's wheel was utilized during the Old Kingdom. Pottery became smoother and more polished, similar to river stones. It was decorated primarily in red pigment. Quartzite particles, which created the rich blue or green glazing, became common during the New Kingdom. Potsherds could be found anywhere and were the most common canvas for writing or drawing, in comparison to the more expensive papyrus sheets. Named after their Greek description, ostraca contained daily life records, letters, or could be drawn upon. Artists drew sketches for temples and tombs, or simply for leisure.
Welcome to the... In pre-Greco-Roman culture, property testified in court. Certain professions were open only to women, such as weaving or professional mourning, while others were available to both genders, including working as servants for the rich households. Homes were generally composed of 3 rooms. First, there was the entrance, furnished with a small bench of brick, probably intended for a statue and protective divinity. Marriages were a social contract rather than a religious construct. Family was vitally important to ancient Egyptians, and children were considered a blessing from the gods. The father, mother, and their children were the nucleus of the family, and cohabitation sometimes extended to mothers-in-law, sisters, aunts, and sisters-in-law. Status and wealth played a large role in the style and size of ancient Egyptian homes. Commoners' houses were built with sun-baked mud bricks.
Orang tajir nih berarti.
Wealthier homes were often painted in white and decorated with various motifs. Town officials and the rich lived in mansions with numerous rooms that were luxuriously decorated. Only temples and tombs meant to last for all eternity were built with stone. Funeral stone inscriptions focused on the main member of a household. Encircling this person would then be a spouse, parents, and children, possibly even siblings. These stones were so structured because there were no surnames in ancient Egyptian culture. Parents and children were a sort of family tree, which allowed for the identification of the deceased.
Tiga lagi, ngomongin beer, wine, and oil.
Welcome to Bread and Beer. While the Mesopotamians invented beer, including using a straw to avoid the sediments and herbs, ancient Egyptians perfected the brewing method.
Orang Egypt.
Beer was the popular drink of ceremonies and festivals. The Festival of Drunkenness was even dedicated to it. Recipes for beer varied over time and depended on the quality of the materials. Once baked, bread would be crumbled into the brew to start the fermentation process. Adding grain enzymes would break down the starches. Once ready, the bread and grain mixture was compressed and then strained through a sieve with water into the mix of malt beer. Once fermented, the beer mash was Once smooth, the beer was stored. It probably couldn't be kept for long. While there are many ancient accounts for making bread, most of the knowledge known about ancient Egyptian brewing comes from an account by the alchemist Zosimus over 300 years after Cleopatra's reign. More recently, food was prepared on the floor until the Middle Kingdom, when cooking benches were introduced. The introduction of durum wheat improved bread quality, meaning that the dough was kneaded by hand or foot, and when sufficiently blended, additional items were added. Ancient Egyptians always had to fight off the omnipresent sand particles that were blown towards them. Despite their best efforts, sand regularly made its way into their food. Additionally, particles from the grain-grinding stone tools and ovens they used also contributed to attrition and prematurely worn teeth. The team tried to portray this through toothache animations and commoners sweeping sand off.
Maksudnya sampai sedetil itu ya. Sakit gigi aja ada animasinya. Karena pasir. It's a wonderful ancient life.
Welcome to Wine in Ancient Egypt. Seth. The ancient Egyptians believed the eye turned into a millennia-old tradition. Grape cultivation and wine production was regimented in the way typical of ancient Egyptian bureaucracy. Egyptians kept careful record. Documentation shows that only certain craftsfolk were allowed to provide the containers required to store and transport. Egyptians had different kinds of wines, most of which ranged in quality from good to very good. The sweet shadé, to which honey had been added. The soft negem, obtained by drying the grapes in the sun. The ma, reserved for religious ceremonies. And finally there was the peyor, the mediocre-rated wine, resulting from the second pressing of grapes and reserved for a less discerning palate.
Last one, I think. Gue impress sih, tapi mungkin kalau nggak suka history agak boring ya. Tapi tadi ini baru daily life aja yang kita lakuin karena butuh buat trofi. Masih banyak lagi tuh yang tadi yang lain kalau mau lakuin.
to oil in ancient Egypt.
Oil.
Castor, sesame, and moringa were the source of the most common oils in ancient Egypt.
Dari tembak api meledak.
Oil was used for various purposes: cosmetics, medical treatments, nutrition, perfume, athletics, and rituals. Ancient Egyptians originally used castor oil in wick lamps, but also for cosmetics, such as facial and hair treatments. There is mention in some papyrus of castor oil being prescribed to treat constipation and help pregnant. Olive trees were present, though scarce, in ancient Egypt's early history, and olives were mostly imported
guys,
from
habis
Syria
ini
and
kita akhiri
Palestine.
videonya.
Their use and cultivation remained uncommon until the mass arrival of Greek settlers
Tinggal tunggu
during the
trofinya
reign of the
pop.
Ptolemies, when demand increased sharply. Olive trees were normally found in the region of the Fayum and the lands surrounding Alexandria.
Oke, di gua trofinya pop, mungkin kalian nggak bisa lihat. Oke, demikianlah discovery tour dari Assassin's Creed Origins. Ya, seperti yang kalian lihat, kita baru selesai daily life. Masih banyak sebenarnya kalau mau menjelajahi lagi, tapi kita sudahi dulu. Kalau kalian suka sama videonya, kalian bisa like, comment, atau subscribe. Nanti kita akan main yang lain lagi ya. Thanks guys, see you next time.